looking at the issue of euthanasia this week. Again, we have two readings that take very different positions on an issue. But it's interesting, I think, to contrast the discussion about this particular issue with the discussion last week. As it turned out, the readings that I thought were the most interesting ones to present to you were ones that didn't examine the issue of the moral status of the fetus when it comes to abortion. We had a defense of abortion that stipulated that the fetus was a person, but then argued that that was not the deciding factor, that there were actually more important things at issue in the issue of abortion. We had an argument against abortion that wasn't interested. Don Marquis wasn't interested in the issue of whether the fetus was a person, whether the fetus had rights, therefore, or whether the fetus had a moral status that meant that it would be wrong to harm it. Argued against abortion on different grounds, having to do with the wrongness of killing in general, that sought to avoid the issue of personhood. But here, in the next couple of weeks, as we take a look at the issue of euthanasia, I think that now the status of the person, that is really what it means to be a person, as opposed to simply a living creature, but to be a person, and what that means in terms of what can and can't be done to a person, even with that person's consent, becomes the main issue here. Looking at Peter Singer's chapter from this book on euthanasia, it's a pretty comprehensive discussion of the issue of euthanasia. There are obviously different sorts of euthanasia. You should pay pretty close attention to that, because there are important differences between voluntary, involuntary, and non-voluntary euthanasia. And certainly, if I've got my terminology right, Singer argues that voluntary and non-voluntary euthanasia are in some cases, at least, not only permissible, but maybe even morally obligatory, whereas involuntary euthanasia is not something that he seriously considers, and I think that does actually follow from his position. But what is this fundamental position? His fundamental position, I think, is that the notion of what he calls the sanctity of life, or the sanctity of human life, is a huge mistake. That is the notion that there's something sacred about a human life. To him, not only makes no sense, but probably has some really negative consequences. And it's not that the sanctity parts, I think, that Singer really would have a problem with, although he's not a religious thinker at all. I don't think he has any religious beliefs. It's the human part. You see that, as you read this, that it's very important to Singer that membership in the species Homo sapiens, that is, literally being biologically a human being, is really not of any moral importance in terms of how one is treated or how one should treat such a being. That is, membership in a certain species does not give one any special importance. That is really the characteristics that one has as a living creature that determine how one should be treated. And it just so happens that the vast majority of human beings have certain other characteristics: self-awareness, rationality, the capacity to take responsibility for their actions, the capacity to form long-lasting and meaningful relationships that do give us a certain status, that gives us certain rights and protections. But that, importantly, it's not our simply being human that does so. So how does that affect his position on euthanasia? Well, it's clear that some human beings lack those characteristics that give us that status as moral creatures with certain status. He says, and this is on page 4 if you print it out, he says, we saw that the fact that a being is a human being, in the sense of a member of the species Homo sapiens, is not relevant to the wrongness of killing it. It is rather characteristics like rationality, autonomy, and self-consciousness that make a difference. Rationality, autonomy, self-consciousness, the ability to think rationally, autonomy, the ability to make decisions for oneself, literally to rule oneself, and self-consciousness, the awareness of self and of being a self in the world. That it's these characteristics that are relevant here. And it's quite clear that not all human beings share those characteristics. That is, you can be a human being without being rational, autonomous, or self-conscious, and all of us were at one time, which I think Don Marquis would point out. All of us were such creatures at one time when we were fetuses or very young children. That is, we lack those characteristics. So, how does this, again, affect the issue of euthanasia? Well, there are certain situations, I think, and this goes to non-voluntary euthanasia, in which if one took a utilitarian point of view, that is, if one was trying to make a decision that would produce the most happiness for everyone involved. I think Singer's arguing pretty strongly that there are situations in which the killing of a human being, and he's not dealing with abortion here, he's dealing with the idea of euthanasia, which is the killing of a human being who has been born. The killing of a human being would result in the best situation in terms of overall happiness for everyone. Now, that may be an arguable point, but I think that's the position he's taking. So that if we were dealing with a human being who lacked those characteristics that might make it wrong to kill it, unless there were other circumstances, for instance, with a young infant severely disabled, if parents wanted that child to live, that would be a compelling reason to do whatever it took to make that child live. But if the parents didn't want that child to live, and especially if, as he goes into detail, if the future of that child was not being projected not to be a life that we would consider worth living, then euthanasia is permissible. Of course, there are other forms of euthanasia, for instance, voluntary euthanasia, where a rational, self-conscious, autonomous human being decides that they want to end their life and looking for help. In Singer's mind, that is a right, or that is something that a human being has a right to as a rational, self-conscious, autonomous being. So, I think that as you look through this, that notion of what it is that makes a person, what it is that gives a person a special status, is quite important here. And we'll see when we read the reading from Bernardine next week. It's important to Bernardine too. It's just that he draws, for his own reason, very different conclusions from the special status of the human being. Not, in his case, not drawing upon ideas of rationality and autonomy giving us a special status, but his idea is that we have a special status because of our relationship with God. So yeah, it's a different sort of take on the issue, and it is one where you have to think about the moral status of human beings and what it is that gives human beings that status.